Hi class, this is Peter. I'm the host of our weekly mailbag, and I'll be here to answer your questions. First, some course business. I've got all the grading done to this point. I did not create the quiz in time last week, so I just gave everybody an A on it, which some of you could really use. I am a little concerned, and so I canceled one of our class discussions this week merely because I'm getting a participation rate that's dropping a little low, and so I'm worried that I'm overburdening you. Either that or you're spacing out, but I'm going to work on the assumption that I'm giving you too much work. So, let's dive into your questions. This one comes from Tyler. With most of the movie elements being diegetic elements, why are non-diegetic elements needed? They're minimal to the story, correct? Well, yes and no. So diegesis is the time and place of the story. And so anything that's extra diegetic is external to that. So example would be a soundtrack. And in the case of a soundtrack or score, where the music has been added to the story, then it could be incredibly vital. There's moments of haunting violin and orchestral music that, if lacking from a scene, the scene would be much less powerful, and yet there is no actual orchestra there. The same is true for plenty of scenes featuring a soundtrack component, so songs written not for the film, that's a score, songs written for other purposes that have been applied to the film. An example of the different distinction here would be Stanley Kubrick's 2001 from 1968, where he was actually hired a composer to make a score, a instrumental orchestral arrangement for the film. While he was working on the film, though, he listened to a lot of Zarathustra's, Thus Spake Zarathustra, and he ended up liking it so much that he included it in the film. And few people who've seen 2001 would feel it would be complete without that extra diegetic score. Now, there's other extra diegetic elements. For example, in Pulp Fiction, when Uma Thurman's character asks Vincent Vega if he's square, and she moves her fingers in the shape of a square and a little dotted line appears, that's intrusive, because we don't usually see that. So one factor is with some extra diegetic elements, they can distract us, but in this instance, of course, it's doing so deliberately. Other extra diegetic elements, though, might include things like text appearing on the screen telling you where and when we are, which might be valuable for audiences to get a sense of when and where we are. So an example of this would be at the opening of Blade Runner, when there's scrolling text that is exposition, explaining what year it is and where we are and what replicants are. Another example would be the extra diegetic music, the soundtrack of Yard of the Month. And I think that the acting, the minimalist writing, and the editing do make it a fast-paced comedy. I think that the music contributes a lot to the theme as well. Now, some sound editors working in conjunction with the editor and the director will include music that seems at first to be extra diegetic, but then turns out actually to be a song that's playing within the story space. The opening of Kill Bill, I believe, a sheriff is driving and we hear what sounds like a soundtrack, but then he adjusts the volume of his radio and we realize this music is diegetic. Austin asks, in Chapter 4 of the reading, the book describes scope as the overall range in time and place of the movie story. Now, Austin here distinguishes between story duration and plot duration. So in Citizen Kane, the scope of the story is 70 years, while the scope of the plot is plot time, which is roughly an hour and 45 minutes. So this is a matter of the economy of editing in storytelling, where, well, as Hitchcock once described film, when he was told that his films were like a slice of life, he said, "No, ma'am, they're like a slice of cake," because he saw his films as life with all of the boring parts chopped out. Similarly, it would be impossible to watch a film of Citizen Kane that was 70 years long. Now, there's the occasional film where story time equals plot time. An example would be Rope. There's a couple of action-adventure films, thrillers, from the 80s and 90s as well. So in this economy, sometimes it's less a fracturing of time and space so complete as in Citizen Kane when 70 years is condensed and travel all over the country is condensed. It can be as simple as a short film where a student's waking up and going to class. So if the whole film's going to be 10 minutes long, if we actually follow the student as she gets up and gets ready and gets in her car and drives, we're not even going to get to school. So what we'll do is have a sequence of shots showing parts of that activity and then editing out the rest. So the director of photography has to work at the direction of the director, following the storyboard, so that the editor has all of the shots he or she needs in order to piece them together with appropriate pacing and without any gaps. Will asks, in Chapter 4 we discussed the protagonist and antagonist. Is it true that the antagonist must always suffer or die in movies to show the character has paid the price for their lack of morals? Well, pretty much, yeah. In early filmmaking, after the Production Code Authority began sort of actually following the self-censorship rules, in 1933, there were clear codes that a film could not be released with a seal of approval unless the antagonist was punished for their lack of morals. However, that black and white Manichaean world became far less satisfying to film audiences of the 1950s and 1960s. We can see in films like Double Indemnity, we have what at first seems to be two protagonists, a man and a woman, meet, but then they begin plotting the murder of her husband, and then they proceed to murder each other, and we realize there's no protagonist in this film. The film might be organized around the main character, who then seems to be playing the role of the protagonist. But when we see that they're not actually matching any conceptions of a good, positive character, then they become known as what's often called an anti-hero. And that's when a film is organized around a primary character who seems to be occupying the role of the hero based on the movie being about them, but they don't actually do good things. So we could see characteristics of the anti-hero in Fight Club, Bonnie and Clyde. It's something that emerged in the second half of the 100 and plus now years of film history, as our own culture became far sort of less accustomed to the notion that there should be good guys and bad guys. In Daryl Zero, Ben Stiller counters his directive employer by saying, there's not a good guys and bad guys, there's just a bunch of guys. This next question is from Portia. Why do some filmmakers make black and white film in today's time? Why are black and white films relevant today? Well, that's a great question. So black and white was functionally the original dominant mode of filmmaking, though there were early experiments in color. But it wasn't until Technicolor became somewhat economical and consistent enough process that color films flourished in the 1930s. However, the colors were still a bit garish and were often used more for romances, Robin Hood, or cartoons, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, while more serious films tended to be in black and white. That began to shift into the 1950s. By 1960, roughly half and half films made were black and white and color, but by 1970, virtually all the films were color. For a while, in the 1930s, the Oscars gave out an Academy Award for cinematography, one for black and white film and one for color. Black and white affects all kinds of matters such as costuming. So, for example, characters wearing outfits when a film is in black and white, the outfits could be wildly uncoordinated in color, but once seen in black and white, they come across much more clearly and starkly. Whereas if the color patterning was planned for a color film but was shot in black and white, it might not work well. A character's dark red jacket and her bright yellow dress might come across as too close in tone. Nowadays, one reason that some folks use black and white is to indicate that something is documentary footage or is history. So an example of this would be in American History X when characters are looking through a film monitor, watching TV, or most notably in an extended flashback scene, the use of black and white indicates the real world history, the past. This is a convention that plays out a number of films, most notably, of course, in Wizard of Oz, where the real world of Kansas is in black and white, and Oz is in color. Now, Yard of the Month, one of our contemporary black and white films, was actually shot in color, and the director and editor was not real happy with his color processing, and so he elected at the last moment, just in post-production, to switch it to black and white, and I think that was a great choice. And I think I just answered Chris McGee's question. What's the goal of Yard of the Month? I was really confused about what the whole meaning was. It was made to look old, but was not. The music gave the film an old movie feel. So another factor there is the film is based on a short story by, I believe, Ron Rash, and he often sets his stories in a historical past, and that shapes the tone and the voice of the story. And so in this case, the director is sticking to that sort of older tone and also kind of older conceptions. Woman makes food, man does work. So the comedy of the film is in the college professor father disengaged from his family, so disengaged that apparently he's forgotten that the uncle is dead. Nevertheless, answers the call and mows the yard, and thereafter does not get dog food for dinner. So I would suggest that the genre of Yard of the Month is comedy, which can be really hard to pull off in a film with virtually no dialogue, and it's only 10 minutes long. All right, the next question comes from Jonathan. Before music, did the long versus close shot have as much of an effect as an audience rather than before movies were introduced with sound? Also, would that increase the production time for the movie itself? Absolutely. So sound introduced some technological challenges when it spread from innovation in 1927 to, by 1929, being industry standard, and all the theaters had to convert themselves for sound. When we watch Singing in the Rain, we're going to see a very humorous demonstration of how sound challenged the production process. In terms of close and distant shots, that one's tough, especially with regard to the use of music. Music and sensed proximity and color, none of these things have a definitive meaning. So we might think, oh, blue is a cold color and red is warm. But there's a moment in The Cell where Vincent D'Onofrio, as this demonic figure living inside his own head, walks down a hallway and hooks in his flesh pull these bright red curtains in reverse. And there's nothing particularly warm. It's extremely cold. Similarly, blue in Kieslowski's Trois Couleurs Bleues from 1993, blue appears throughout the film, and it's deeply intimate and soft and ethereal. Similarly, proximity, an extreme long shot can make characters seem tremendously isolated and lonely against a stark landscape, a la John Ford's The Searchers, whereas an extreme close-up, as in the opening of Blade Runner, where we're seeing the lens of an eye and a city reflected in it, does not feel intimate at all. Okay, so another question about, a question about duration. Is screen duration typically an element that develops on its own due to the other characteristics of a film, or is it determined during the pre-production and production phases? So here's the deal. Some studios will contractually only accept scripts that are 127 pages long, because the convention in Hollywood filmmaking is that one page equals 1 minute. So if there's a ton of dialogue, like in a David Mamet film, then that 1 minute page is going to be filled with words. In a much more quiet film, like Brokeback Mountain, a page might feature hardly any stage instruction or dialogue. These matters are carefully planned, most often in the script writing stage, given the sense of how long the film is going to be in 1 minute per page, and then in storyboarding. Now, sometimes a film goes straight to storyboard. The only example I know of this, well, two examples I know of this. Sin City, adapted by Rodriguez from Frank Miller's graphic novels, effectively used the comic book, the graphic novel, as a storyboard. And George Miller and Mad Max Fury Road didn't have an initial script, but was instead 3,000 storyboard demonstrations of what would happen in the film. So, while the average length of a film in the United States is 90 to 125 minutes, certainly there are films like P.T. Anderson's Magnolia, which bloats to 3 hours, which I think is a perfect length for it, and I would be happy if it was 4, to much, much shorter films. Dumbo, for example, an early Disney hit from 1940-41, was I think barely 65 minutes long, and some of the members of the studio wanted it cut to a short, but Disney demanded that it be released as a feature, and it helped the studio survive. There were 2 really interesting and I thought successful conversations in the class discussion. One focusing on Beyoncé's Formation, which all of you seemed perfectly delighted by, which makes me happy. And also you seemed not entirely discouraged by Meshes of the Afternoon. Most of my students respond to Meshes of the Afternoon with plenty of unhappiness and boredom. And that's just the nature of the art form. It's an experimental avant-garde film from 1943. Arguably, it's the first one ever, and it's also directed by a woman. And so I think it pairs really nicely with Beyoncé's Formation, which similarly lacks clear narrative structure, clearly also bounces around in time and space, albeit far more broadly. And it uses sound, obviously, in a much richer way because it's a music video. The other conversation that I thought was interesting was a questioning of editing and the manipulation of time and space and how it can be overdone. And there's plenty of critics who agree with you. Right now, Christopher Nolan is a target for this, and some love him and some hate him for the way in which he uses editing to transform the relationships of time and space. Now recognize in Yard of the Month or Cargo, time and space stay really, really consistent. Whereas in Inception, time expands or condenses based on how many layers into a dream the group is. And in his current film, Dunkirk, we'll see that there are 3 stories that are playing out at the same time in roughly the same space, but only by piecing it together can we realize that one of those stories takes a week, one takes a day or 2, and one takes just a couple of hours. So some critics dislike that. Other critics, like myself, that's why we love Christopher Nolan's filmmaking. That's it for today's mailbag. I'll be looking forward to your questions this weekend, and I'll have that next mailbag posted up much more early in the week. Do be thinking about what you want to write your final paper on, and also you probably want to relate that to your podcast. Get some rest, revise those scene description analyses, take those quizzes, and I'll talk to you soon.